The people you are talking to are on vacation. They want to have fun. They're really choosing to go to your winery instead of going to Disneyland. And if you give them a 12-minute dissertation on malolactic fermentation, next time when they walk out of the hotel, they're saying, let's go to Disneyland. When Apple introduces a new iPhone, do they bring out a group of engineers to explain how they made it?
You're not trying to learn how to paint.
Right.
You just want to interest about that when you wanted to learn about to paint. But if you're not learning about to be a winemaker, what are you going to be interested about production?
I think we're putting the focus completely on the wrong thing. We should be putting our focus on how can we be memorable. And the way you get to be memorable is not to convince them intellectually somehow that your wine is 7.3% better than the wine of the competitor. The way to be memorable is to talk to their heart.
It's much easier to complain than actually make change it or do something different yourself.
None of the certification programs in the wine industry teach the only skill you need to be successful in the wine industry, which is how to sell it. It's not only that they don't teach it, they don't even understand that it can be taught.
You never ask yourself what we do and why you do, what's wrong, what we can improve. Sometimes we asking that, but you already have all the answers. Hi guys, today I have a very different topic. I'm very excited about it because I'm talking about this topic quite a lot. I have Paul Wagner with me, but Paul Wagner is just going to give a little bit connection with my story. I was a very similar person of it, like a little similar. How am I going to explain? I have in my perspective a very close and square when I did my course with Paul. I think it was like in 2021, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then he said something to me completely different. I haven't heard it for all my life in the wine industry. He really challenged my thinking. And I think since then, lots of things started to change in my life. We just see different perspectives and be open to learning different ways to think. And then for that reason, for me, it's very good. It's very special for me for you accepted to do this episode with me, because you're one of those persons, those people who really challenging my thinking and the beginning of it, like my transformation, the Priscilla transformation, the Priscilla different versions. So it's great to have you here. You have been working in education for decades. So we wanted to hear a little bit about like how everything started, how you choose that career. You work pretty much in education in the wine industry for very respected big names and universities and institutions. So tell a little bit about you, what you have done so far in the wine industry for these few decades.
Well, let's start with how I got interested in all of this. When I was at university, I actually studied sociology and education, but I left the university to go study classical guitar in Spain. And I studied in Spain and lived in Spain for 5 years. And actually gave concerts for a while. But then when I moved back, my wife and I were then married. She's a professional chef, and we started living in the Napa Valley. And if you live in the Napa Valley, there's really one industry, which is wine. So I started working in the wine industry, but not as an expert. I joined as someone who had some experience with sociology and with education, but not really with wine. I learned, obviously, when you work at a small winery, you learn everything. And in 10 years or so, I went from being a complete novice. My wife says I knew more about wine than I think I did. To working and consulting with wineries using that background in sociology and education. But I also eventually formed my own communications and marketing agency. And I started applying those rules of sociology and education to the wine industry. So I actually ran an agency that represented some of the biggest names in the Napa Valley, as well as organizations such as the Union de Grand Cru de Bordeaux, the Consortio di Chianti Classico, great champagne houses, vintage port houses. I really represented just about everyone you can think of in the world. At one point, I added it up. We had clients in New Zealand, Australia, 8 different countries in Europe, plus all over the United States. And one of my projects was that I got a promotional project from the cork industry in Portugal. And it was to educate winemakers throughout the world on how they could use corks so they would have fewer problems with corks. And so I, on the one hand, was taking winemakers to Portugal, but I also suggested that we take some academics there, because academics were the people teaching the young winemakers how to use the material. And one of the people I took there was a man by the name of Dr. Stephen Krebs, who ran the wine program at Napa Valley College. And when we came home from that trip, he called me up and he said, I would like to meet with you. So I went down and I met with him, and he said, Paul, we have another degree we're offering at Napa College, and we've never really found the right person to teach the curriculum. And I think you're the right person. Would you consider joining the faculty here? In addition to your regular job, would you join our faculty here to teach wine marketing and wine communication to the wine industry in the Napa Valley? And I said, well, I'm kind of busy with my company, maybe, maybe not. And he said, well, here's the curriculum. Take it home, take a look at it, and tell me what you think. And it turned out the curriculum was terrible. It was terrible because the way they had taught this course in the past it was, I think, 18 weeks. And they had 18 different speakers come in, and each speaker said something about marketing and sales, but there was no coordination. Some of the speakers contradicted themselves, which fair enough. But if you're a student and you're trying to put all of this together into some sort of coherent study, it was impossible. So I went back, I tossed the curriculum on his desk, and I said, Steve, I'd love to do this, but there's no way I could teach this, because if I taught this material, I'd have to rewrite the curriculum from start to finish. And he looked at me and he says, that's great, you're hired. And I said, wait, that's not what I meant. But no, he hired me 30 years ago. And he has since retired, but I have continued to teach there and apply those basic, theories of education ever since. And I'm teaching, I think, more now than of course, I'm retired from my agency. I sold that 6-7 years ago. So now really what I'm doing in my retirement is teaching classes at Napa College. And as you know, lecturing at UC Davis, at MBA programs in Europe, at United Nations wine tourism conferences. I lecture all over the place now. If you'll give me a microphone, I'll talk.
So yeah, that's good. That's a great story behind that. So yeah, just for people get a lot of context, we met for the first time. Like, I think I met you first, because when you give a class, you probably don't remember your students, but we remember the teachers. But it's very hard for you to remember them. I think we pretty much was like 30 or 40 people in that class. Was a lot. Right. It was online as well. It was not in person. So it's much harder for you to memorize your students and faces and things like that. But the first time I met Paul,
I never admit that. Anytime any student comes to me and says, you probably don't remember me, I will always say, of course I remember you. Can't tell you your name, can't tell you where you're from, but of course you're a student of mine. I remember you.
Well, I don't expect you, like, I'm never gonna do that question for you, because it's very hard, because for 30 years you have so many students. It's very hard for you to memorize all the names, all the people you have been teaching. But I remember when you're talking about we're teaching about marketing. I think it was that marketing, and
Yeah.
you see Davis, and then we're talking about like who hire. We talk about labels and many things, but I think your talk, it was about when you hire someone for work in tasting rooms, and then you told never hire someone very expert. And I don't know, I was actually finished my WSET full at that, like then it's just like spent like $11,000 for that. It's like, oh no, don't tell me. And it was work in the tasting rooms. I was feel like absolutely destroyed. So like I just spent $11,000. So they're like, what are you talking about it? And it was like really challenging my thinking, but now I understand why and the reasons. But it would be nice to talking about the different perspective you have. It's not discriminating people actually study these other courses, because I paid for, and I know that. But I just see what really the disconnections you need to be told. We need to telling about, we need to discussing about. A few disconnection things we have in the education system, and with different things we have in the wine industry. When you prepare someone to be able to go to do the job, but when they try to do the job, they disconnect with what the consumers really care or want, how the consumer experience wine. So I know people probably not going to like this conversation, lots of people, because, like me, when the first time you told that, I was like, oh my God, I just paid $11,000 for my diploma. Blah, you can't tell me that because I work in a tasting room. So I know the pain, I know the feeling, because I was one of them. But I think it's important for us to give that chance for people have another perspective anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's up to you what do you want to believe, and it's up to you what you want to follow. But it's good for us to know different perspectives to put in the table, and you can judge what is good for you or not. And then that's why I wanted to actually told it in this podcast, telling about us in this podcast, telling us about it, that point where you're challenging my thinking in 2021. So why do you think the disconnection of the education system?
And to be fair, my presentation there was less targeted at people who are looking for a job in a tasting room. It was more targeted at people who were hiring employees to work in a tasting room. And one of the things I said very specifically, first of all, wonderful, wonderful quote from Marshall McLuhan, an expert on media and communication. His most famous quote is, of course, the medium is the message, which applies in this case. But one of the things he says is that those who say education and entertainment have nothing to do with each other don't understand the first thing about either topic. And to me, this is critical, because when I make that presentation about who you should hire in a tasting room, I make the point that hiring someone who has a massive amount of wine knowledge, but doesn't have the personal skills to entertain and make it fun and make it, the people you are talking to are on vacation. They want to have fun. They're really choosing to go to your winery instead of going to Disneyland. And if you give them a 12-minute dissertation on malolactic fermentation, next time when they walk out of the hotel, they're saying, let's not go to a winery, let's go to Disneyland. It's more fun. Yes. So the problem we have is we teach people this incredible amount of technical production, what I call production trivia. And yet it doesn't really matter to the people we're talking to. When we're talking to someone in a tasting room, in a restaurant, in a wine shop, people are more interested in the story behind the product than they are in the production details. And the example I always use is music. When Taylor Swift or Elton John releases a new piece of music, no one says that you should understand the use of harmonic suspension and syncopation, because then you will appreciate the music of Taylor Swift more deeply. And yet we in the wine industry tell people that in order to appreciate wine, they need to know every detail about how it is made. One example I use, what kind of guitar strings does Eric Clapton use? Nobody knows. Possibly the most famous rock and roll guitarist on the planet. The only people who know the answer to that question are real guitar fanatics. And they're not the people buying the music. They're more likely to be making music than buying music. And at the same time, the public really wants to know what's in his heart when he's playing that song. And that's what we don't talk about when we talk about wine education. We keep explaining to people over and over again how wine is made, and they don't care. So I think we need to change. I have always said, instead of hiring wine experts to work in your tasting room, you should hire actors, because actors know how to work with an audience. Actors understand that education is not one direction. My brother is quite an expert on education and sociology, in fact, more so than I, by far. And he has a statement he likes to make. He says, in the old days, we used to say that a great instructor, a great teacher, is someone who would really cover the material. Today, I think the best definition of a great teacher is someone who uncovers the material. It's not that they give you endless amounts of information, but instead they expose you to new ideas, they expose you to concepts, and they encourage you to explore the topic on your own. That's a great teacher. If you're encouraged and enthusiastic about the topic, you will learn. If you are taught
makes people curious.
Exactly. And so learning is participatory. An actor understands that the single most important part of any play is the audience. You can have wonderful costumes and a wonderful set and beautiful actors and all the rest, but if you have an audience that's not involved, you have nothing. And the same is true of education. If you're not involving your students in the process, you're not teaching very well. And so I always say, hire actors. They're much better at communicating with an audience than a wine expert. And then the other group I like to hire is primary school teachers, because they understand how to control people. And when a third grade teacher tells you to sit down, you sit down. That's an important element when you're working in a tasting room.
Yeah, no, it's a I like the analogy, and if you talk even beyond it, like it recently, I don't know if you saw the Jaguar car. They actually started with that marketing where they're talking about lots of features in the car, and then they changed it. The communication was brave to change because they couldn't sell. Did you see that? Did you see the change of the marketing? And I think that's something like and something we need to take in as example if you wanted to see what the other outside of the wine industry, even the people when they try to sell the features, it's not really working because people wanted to know what's for me. So when you talk about production, you're not talking what is for me anymore in this generation is coming along. The Gen Z is all about me. It's all about me. I don't know if you have people Gen Z around you, but talking today is all about me. So that's what is for me in that, And but I think that is natural for not just for Gen Z, but I think they're more stronger about those things than the previous generations. But I think that's probably something you industry don't notice.
There's another point, which is when I started teaching at Napa College, and I don't just teach marketing and sales. I've taught wines of the world, wines of California. I teach some sensory analysis. I'm doing a hospitality training class right now. But when I started, I would ask my students, what are the 5 classic grape varieties of Bordeaux? And someone would raise their hand, oh, Cabernet Sauvignon, yes, and Merlot, yes, and eventually we would get there. If I ask that question today, my students do this. Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Malbec. No?
True.
They don't need to memorize this stuff. They can find it on their phone in less than 5 seconds. And what we
oh, they watch.
Or their watch, yes, or their goggles. So what we really need to be teaching them is not what, but we need to be teaching why. We need to be teaching the motivations. I often draw the comparison between making a regional wine, and let's use an example of Beaujolais. The wines they make in Beaujolais, yes, there's one winemaker who does something a little different and another who may use a little more of this or that. But in essence, the wines of Beaujolais have grown up in that region for 500 years. There's an analogy there because it's like the cathedral. A cathedral is built as a communal effort. It's not one person. Yes, there's one person who may make a certain statue, or there's one person who on one of the granite blocks may carve his initials to say, I did this part. But the overall vision of the cathedral is a communal expression of what they think and what they believe and how they work together. That's wine. And we need to stop talking about fermentation temperatures and acid levels and oak regimens, and we need to be explaining how that culture created that cathedral, that style of wine. The cathedral in Laon in northern France, on the towers of the cathedral are cows, stone cows on the cathedral, because the people responsible for ultimately building and creating that cathedral were farmers. And at one point they said to the bishop, we're done. We're not working for you because this isn't our cathedral, it's your cathedral. And in recognition of the important role they played in building the cathedral, the bishop agreed that they would put cows on the bell towers of the cathedral so they can say, it was us. The farmers are the people who built this cathedral. That's what we should be teaching in wine. And we don't. We don't tell any of the backstory. If we do, it's anecdotal, it's off to the side, it's just in case you're interested. And I teach exactly the opposite. I teach those big stories. And then I say, if you want to know the titratable acidity or the alcohol level of this wine, you can look it up. If you want to memorize the grape varieties or the appellations of Beaujolais, you can do that. But what's really important is that you understand the philosophy, the culture, the community that created Beaujolais. And then you can worry about the rest of the stuff.
And the probably people more interested about that. They want to know why they created Beaujolais,
exactly.
Why then they have a Burgundy, why these places exist. You know,
yeah.
Why if I drink a Beaujolais, it's going to be a different sensation if I drink a Burgundy wine. So I think that's probably, people want to know about that, but it doubt to, when you say why, but the thing is, we think when you ask you for why, you're looking for the production method, because that's what being told to us. If you ask me why Burgundy is better than Beaujolais, so I will probably say like, oh, because the fermentation, like in Beaujolais, they have this cutoff of fermentation and blah, blah, blah. That's how I've been told it to explain to people, And that's what the story and the narrative we created. And that is why we keep doing.
Why doesn't Burgundy ever use the Beaujolais, the Gamay grape to make Burgundy? Do you know that story?
No.
Because the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, said that the Beaujolais grape, the Gamay, is a bastard grape and should never be planted in Burgundy because he preferred Pinot Noir.
Really?
True story. Yeah. Yes. And now at least it makes you want to try a bottle of Beaujolais, doesn't it? To say, what do you mean a bastard grape? Let me see this grape. Is it really that
And
bad?
you,
And of
already
course,
took
what
like
we
a time
learn
from
is
my face.
we taste the wine and we discover that it's not Pinot Noir, but it actually makes some wonderful, interesting, delicious wines in a different style, and Philip the Bold was wrong. But you need to tell these stories. One of the examples I use in Spain, you know that in the central part of Spain, really, Castilla-La Mancha and Rioja and that whole area, Toro, Ribera del Duero, all of those wines are primarily Tempranillo, if they're red.
Yeah.
But when you go to Catalonia, Catalonia makes wines from a wide variety of grapes. Garnacha, which is a Spanish grape, not a French grape. It's not Grenache, it's Garnacha, and it began in Spain. Monastrell, which we teach as Mourvedre because we learn about it again in France, but it's actually a Spanish grape, comes from the monasteries in northern Spain. They make wine from a Carignan. There's actually a town in Spain called Cariñena, where the Carignan grape is also from that region. And the question is why? Why in Catalonia is this big selection of grapes and different styles of wine, red, white, sparkling, sweet, everything. And in Rioja, Tempranillo, dry red wine. And the answer goes back to the 1400s, because when Queen Isabella married King Ferdinando, Ferdinand was from Aragon and Isabella was from Castilla. And when they married, they unified Spain and they completed the reconquest. The central section of Spain was the heart of Castilla. And Isabella had a very simple political rule. Remember, at the time when she began her efforts, there were Jews in Spain, there were Muslims in Spain. And she, when she unified Spain, she had an iron fist. And she said there will be one law, one faith, and one king. In Spanish, it's even better because it's un rey, una ley, y una fe. No? Well, the people who agreed with that in Castilla-La Mancha still make one wine, it's Tempranillo, and that's what they do. But in Catalonia, they always looked more to the Mediterranean, to the east, to the north, and so they had these combinations, and they love to play with different grapes. So if you buy Rioja, it just says Rioja, and it's 75, 80, 90% Tempranillo. But if you buy a wine in Catalonia, could be Garnacha, could be Monastrell, could be Cariñena, could be a combination of those. And it will say on the bottle the name of the grape rather than the region, because that's what they do. It's a cultural difference that led to that.
And you're teaching that culture, because the culture is much easier for people memorize it. Why always is going to be this place Tempranillo, and the other one why this always going to be blind, because you're teaching the culture behind of the different regions inside of Spain. And then this is staying in your mind. And when you get Catalonia, you know always it's going to be a blend. For more, you don't remember all the names of the grapes because it depends on your level of interest.
Could be a blend, could be individual varietal wines. But yeah. So to me, again, when I think about wine as, some people, I don't agree with this. Some people say wine is art. I say wine is a very highly skilled craft, but I don't think necessarily it's art. But if you compare wine to art, the way we teach wine is to memorize the brush strokes of each individual painter to show how you can tell whether it was a Renoir or a Monet. And I think we should be talking about, wait a minute, why is it a picture of a naked lady with a goat? That's what we want to talk about. Who cares whether the brush strokes were big or little? I want to know the story of the lady and the goat.
Yes, yes, yes. And definitely for me, it's gonna be more interesting. If I see like some more like a picture of art, I don't want it to know what the pencil they actually paint that, because I don't understand. I have absolutely no idea what's gonna be a
Yeah,
difference for painting different, because I'm not trying to learn how to paint.
right.
You just want to interest about that when you wanted to learn about to paint. But if
That's
you're
a
not learning about to be a winemaker, what are you going to
if
be
you
interested about production?
if you just
I
want
think
to
it's just the
enjoy it,
narrative we've been told.
yeah. If you just want to enjoy it, you don't need to know how to make it. All you need to know is how to enjoy it. And one of the things I always laugh about is that, well, it's a sad story, but there are 300,000 wines for sale in the US market, and every brand is fighting, trying to come up with something that will make them stand out. And so in many ways, what they're trying to get consumers to do is remember their brand. That the essence of building a brand, first of all, is to have something in the mind of the consumer that says, when I think about that brand, I remember something, ideally something positive. And then
Mhm.
you put them in a tasting room, and the first thing you tell them is that your white wine spent 7 months in a combination of French and American oak, and your red wine spelled, and I will guarantee you can ask those people when they leave the tasting room, they will not remember a single thing you've told them. They will
No.
remember whether the person was nice. And so I think we're putting the focus completely on the wrong thing. We should be putting our focus on how can we be memorable. And the way you get to be memorable is not to convince them intellectually somehow that your wine is 7.3% better than the wine of the competitor. The way to be memorable is to talk to their heart, to make them fall in love with you. And you cannot do that explaining how you make the wine. You can only do that by explaining why you make the wine.
Exactly. 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 Very well said. And the other thing is well, you don't make your wine any different of like it, because how many wines have 18 months in barrels or French oak?
Yeah, yeah.
It's not a point of a difference for me, because if you have a look at it, it's just a, it's just a, like I can taste your wine in Napa 18 months in oak, and I can taste your wine from Australia 18 months in oak. It's not a really a point of difference. Not gonna make a difference of your wine and my wine
Right,
because 18 months in oak, because I have plenty of wines that's been
right.
1.5 in barrels. So French oak, yeah, have plenty of the 18 months French oak. So
But there's an
they use it the same production in a way. So I don't know
but
how you
there's
convince
even a
people my wine is better than yours if it just by production, because there's absolutely so many wines made in this like in very similar ways. So
and it's
it's
even
still
worse.
barrels, it's still fermentation, it's still
Yeah,
the same thing.
but we lie to them about the oak too, because if you ask any winemaker, how long does the wine go in oak? He says, oh, as you say, 18 months in oak. Great. Now let's pull up the cellar records, because in fact, what you did was you put 70% of the wine in new oak barrels. And then you put about 15% in some older barrels, because you probably want to continue the oxidation process, but you don't want it to pick up so much flavor from the barrels. So you're going to put a little extra in older barrels. And then you're going to put a little more, the last 15% you're going to put in a tank, because if you really do over oak the wine, you need to be able to back blend a little bit and fix that problem. And then you put the blend together and you use 90% of the one in the barrel and another 80% of this one. And then at the last minute, you decide, what would be really good is if we just put 3% of this other wine and we blended it in to give it a little more life, raise the acidity a little bit. And then you tell people, yes, this wine was in oak for 18 months. No, it wasn't. Some of it was. Some of it was somewhere else. Some of it was in a tank. You blended it all back together. And you tell them as if this is somehow important. I was talking to a winemaker the other day. We were at a wine tasting together, and we were talking about winemakers talking about wine. And we were talking about this exact topic. And I said, you know, the funny thing is consumers, even people in the trade, expect winemakers to remember the technical details of a wine they made 8 years ago, right?
Yes.
And I was telling him, I said, you know, here we are in 2025. So let's go back to 2017. What was the acid level and the pH level and the alcohol level and the bricks at harvest for your Sauvignon Blanc? And he laughed and he said, oh, that's easy, Paul. The bricks was 24.3 and the TA was 0.68 and the pH was 3.45 and we ended up with an alcohol of 13.9. And I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, I have no idea, but that's probably close. It usually is around those numbers. And then we're telling these wine lovers, oh, it's incredibly important that you remember. The winemaker doesn't think it's important. Taste the wine.
This one, enjoy the wine and just have a little bit fun and tell the stories. I think that's pretty much what we're missing in the wine space. And I guess I don't know how, because I'm just 13 years working in the wine industry. You probably know when everything started. Why this narrative started in the wine industry from the beginning? Like, why we started to be, because you have been you have so many decades of work in the wine industry right now. You probably see that evolution. Can you just explain to us like why this thing started and how it became so everyone started to studying that and talking about it? That's just became something I just did it because I have been told to do it. And but you know, I wanted to see like how everything can happen in the wine industry, because we're younger, we're millennials, we have no idea, we're just following the what have been told to us. And but if you probably know the story behind it, the mental theory, I don't know, I'm just making some questions. I don't even know if you have the answers.
So there are two threads we have to follow here. The first thread is that in the English-speaking world, the general role model we follow, the sense of what wine is, comes from the British upper class of 70 to 100 years ago. Okay, in England, the working people drank beer, and the upper class drank wine. And one of the ways that you showed that you were upper class, if you remember My Fair Lady, she has to learn how to talk differently. She has to learn how to dress differently. She has to learn everything different because they don't want her to be perceived as someone from the lower classes. So knowledge about wine was one of those social keys that you could demonstrate. I am clearly a more educated and more cultured person than those people down there who drink beer. So that's
this is in UK. That was the mentality in UK. Okay, makes a lot of sense.
That's one element of it. There's a second element of it, which is the wine industry is primarily presented by small producers who make the product themselves. This is a big difference from, say, computers. And the example I always use is Apple. If someone makes a new wine and they release it to the market, who do they ask to talk about the wine? The winemaker. And the winemaker comes out and talks about the only thing the winemaker knows. We carefully selected our vineyards. We handcrafted, Elizabeth Slater does a wonderful thing where she says every small winery in the world has exactly the same unique story. They're a small family winery. They carefully select their vineyards. They carefully make their wines, and they've won some awards, and that's what makes them different. And of course, they're all exactly the same. We ask winemakers to explain the wine, and when they explain the wine, they explain the only thing they know. Let me pull out my technical notes. They were not picked as winemakers because they're brilliant public speakers. They were picked as winemakers because they know how to make wine. They'll tell you the bricks at harvest, the titratable acidity at harvest. They'll tell you the pH at harvest. They'll tell you everything about how they made the wine. On the other hand, when Apple introduces a new iPhone, do they bring out a group of engineers to explain how they made it? Do they explain the inner workings of the computer that allow them to do whatever it does? No, because Apple's a big enough company to think maybe we should hire some specialists, marketing people to talk about the product, because that's how you sell something. Engineers make, marketing people sell. And the wine industry, for its history, has been sold by the people who make it. And they're lousy at selling wine. The irony is a few of them are really good. And the ones who are really good at marketing, suddenly their wines are internationally famous. And everybody says, oh, but I taste my wine. It's not any worse. My wine is just as good. Of course, it's just as good. The difference isn't in the quality of the wine. The difference is in the quality of the marketing. And then you talk to the winemakers and they say, oh, but we don't do marketing. Our wine sells itself. Well, it turns out it doesn't sell itself. And that's kind of a problem.
Oh my goodness! I'm sorry for my big laugh because that story became so familiar for my word. Like everyone I say, talking about those in marketing because the wine is so good they sell by itself. Yeah, it's something like a very common story. Like, and I think it's just I don't know how these stories became in the people's mind because everyone else, even like Louis Vuitton and an inexpensive other product, they do lots of marketing, and then I just don't understand why the wine industry always felt like people just gonna come into me. I don't need to do anything to looking for customers. The customers will come to me all the time.
Yeah.
I just don't know when did this started. Like when it was like it didn't have a competition before. That is why always they sold everything, and that's why this the big problem because the competitions became bigger competition, and and you have
and
people
global
drinking. It just make no sense. Like, why did we put that in the mind? The customers will come to me all the time, like, and you're looking for other company. Maybe that's something I want to ask you because you have much more experience than me. Maybe it was like that for many other types of business, and the other business challenged themselves and changed themselves, but the wine industry just keeping doing the same thing and didn't change it as in the same time the other business. Could be something like this. I'm just giving like a very theory, more question than
Robert Mondavi is the most famous winemaker in America, possibly the most famous winemaker in the world. And his policy was always to say, we will never advertise. Because advertising implies that your wine isn't good enough to sell itself. Now, Robert Mondavi said that, but Robert Mondavi spent 250 to 300 days a year on the road selling his wine. If the wine sells itself, that was a lot of time in airplanes and hotels for somebody who is selling wine that sells itself. And the other side of that is, to me, the perfect illustration of this. He is the most famous winemaker in America. He did not, in fact, make the wine at his winery. He started his winery with Warren Winiarski for red wines and Mike Gergich for white wines. He hired Zelma Long to make his wines. He hired Jean-Vive Janssen to make his wines. He had wonderful, talented, expert winemakers because he was on the road 250, 300 days a year. And yet he told the story. And by telling the story, he became the most famous winemaker in America. And today you can still ask people, who in Napa Valley is the most famous winemaker? And they will tell you, oh, it's Robert Mondavi.
Yes, and that's the one I really know about it.
And it's because he marketed when everybody else was making wine.
But he told the people to not advertise when he was doing his marketing.
He wasn't doing advertising, but he was certainly doing promotion and public relations in a very big way. He had a director of public relations for Robert Mondavi Winery before any other winery had such a person on staff.
Wow, that's a very fascinating story. So he didn't advertise it like in magazines and things like that, but he really went to that he didn't like it what we're talking today, like a personal brand. He was, hey, I'm Robert Mondavi. How are you? That's my wine. And then just kind of a personal brand strategy he did in the past.
And in fact, he was back when he was alive and he owned his winery. So in the 1980s, the 1990s, it was quite possible that you would drive up to Robert Mondavi Winery, and on any given morning, you might get out of your car, walk up to there's a big archway that's the entrance to the winery, and this little old man would be there, and he would shake your hand and he would say, "Hi, I'm Bob Mondavi. Thanks for visiting my winery today." Now, go to all the other wineries that are owned by people who want to be just like Robert Mondavi, and none of them ever stand out in front of the winery shaking the visitors' hands. They're all flying around on jets or working in the laboratory or doing something important. And the one thing Bob Mondavi always understood is the most important thing you can do at a winery is talk to your customers.
Yes.
And I think even more important, what Robert Mondavi knew is you don't only talk to your customers, you listen to them. Yes. And he would, by going out on the road, he would know this is a story people like, that's a story people don't respond to. And he did it for 60 years, 70 years. So he knew. And he knew if he stood up and explained all the technical details of the wine, people would go to sleep. But if he told them a good story, if he told them something that was memorable, a memorable story is one that when they leave, they go home and they call their brother and say, you know, I was just at this wine tasting. I heard this amazing story. That's a story. No one has ever done that, to explain that the wine was made from a combination of Grenache and Carignan. No one has ever called their brother about that. But they have called their brother to tell a really great story about a place, about a person.
Yes. So I think you said something that, and hiding of everything you said, I just wanted to put in an exposure. How important is relations? How important is the public relation to you go out to talk with people, building that relationships? Because lots of people thinking just being the computer, sending mails, it's going to make selling wines. You know, I think people sometimes think it's so easy to sell wine, but, you know, and there's have so many people promise you everything for you, like, oh, you just need send emails, and you're gonna make some sales. But they don't understand, like, even 60 years ago, like you just explained, like a beautiful story of Robert Mondavi. I think that's inspired story, to be honest. The importance for us to just see, you know, get out,
get out,
go there, talk to people.
Yes.
You know, do your public relationship, and then, you know, I think that's something I don't see the wine industry, or lots of people, not just in the wine industry, wine business in general, you know, from different areas, service consultancy, you know, it's not only one way here. Going out to do some talking, to build like relationships, to go around and be in many events they can, to be able just to building that the trust between people, because at the end of the day, people buy from people. And then it's interesting because I see lots of wineries where they're just like, oh, I'm not selling. But what do you do? I'm sending mails to people, but, you know, it's like, and I put it like a bottle of wine on my Instagram, or, you know, we'll pay for Instagram to sell your wine with a pot of wine. And that's, you know, and you don't see results from that kind of thing, because, you know, people, I don't want to put something in my face to say, buy here, you know, it's like, oh, look at me, buy here, look, I'm awesome. You know, I think that's something like Robert Mondavi just inspired winemaker. And then the story of he told us today was amazing. That's actually he's spending most of the time actually on the road, putting his business there. Then actually just home and send emails and they say, hey, look at me. I think it's a great story and an inspired story to be able to say, look, if you want to sell, go out, and talk with people, do a lot of PR.
There's another way to look at this, because every winery I know does what is called a competitive set tasting. I think you know what these are. If a winery is going to release a new wine, they go and they buy 6 other wines, roughly the same price, the same style, and they taste them blind to see how their wine compares with the other wines, right? Every winery does this. Put 2 winemakers in a room together, and the first thing they will do is start pulling out each other's wines and tasting them and comparing and talking. Absolutely good idea. Why don't they do this with their marketing? Why don't they compare the email they're sending out with the emails the other wineries are sending out to make sure their emails are better than their competition? They worry about their wine, but they don't worry about they don't visit other tasting rooms to see, oh, those people are doing something different and it seems to be working. We should learn, we should get better. They don't do any of that. So they are very conscious and often competitive about wine quality. They don't do exactly the same thing with the other half of the business, the half that is going to determine their success, which is the marketing. They don't compare their website to other wineries' websites. They don't compare their tasting rooms. They don't do any of this. And first of all, I absolutely, totally agree with you that the way to sell wine is with a human connection. A blind email is not a human connection. That human connection has to be built on some human contact. And wineries don't do enough of that. And when they do, they hire someone to talk to the public. I'm too busy. We hire this person to talk to the public. They don't train them. So that person doesn't have the complete training they need. They don't train them, for example, on public speaking. Here you are putting someone in front of the most important people in your company, your customers, and you're giving them no training. What company does that? Only wineries. Even a restaurant will meet every day with the staff and say, these are the specials, here's what we need to do, let's make sure this happens. They will have, a restaurant has trainings every week at least. Wineries, nah. And then they complain.
Yes. Yeah. I think a complaint is something like human does in a way. Human really love complaining about everything.
Yes.
and then
I'm complaining right now.
Yes, I like is complain. I feel like it's much easier complain than make something yourself. I think it's much easier complain than actually make change it or do something different yourself. So I think that is natural from human being. I guess it's you need to be in a very evolution stage to stop to complain and make something yourself, because that's just something most of people do it. But to finalize this talk, actually I found like this a very interesting conversation, because we cover sales as well in the end. Education, sales, marketing, it's something like the wine industry really needed to more deeply understand what we can improve and do better from now, because we definitely struggle with those 3 subjectives, like how we can do like more relationships, how we can building a better sales systems, and how we'll actually be able to change the message in the marketing to giving another perception. Give you the perception of wine is more about stories, enjoyment. It's not like a classroom. I need to go into, our university for 4 or 5 years, like I do for doctors. I think that's something we needed to clarify and make it easier for consumers to enjoy the wine without to look like they need to, go into a university, they need to study 4 years before they drink a wine. I think that's sometimes people, that's what they think. It's I don't drink wine because I don't know anything about it. And
Right.
then
It's
you
funny.
you should not keep going this way. You can drink it. You don't
Yeah,
need to
the
know.
example
You can learn afterwards. It's fine.
the example I always use is that when I'm on an airplane and someone sits next to me and we start talking a little bit, if they learn I'm a musician, that I was trained as a guitarist, they often say, "Oh, you know what kind of music I like?" And they tell me what kind of music they like. If they know I'm in the wine business, they say, "Oh, what wine should I be drinking?" So there's a big difference between those two things. With music, they're happy to share what they like. With wine, they're terrified. We've done that. As an industry, we've done that. When I was speaking at a conference years ago, Texon, the biggest sommelier conference in the world. And I was there with a speaker from the Society of Wine Educators, the Court of Master Sommeliers, and WSET, I think. And we were talking about wine education. And I made the point, and this would have been 10 or 15 years ago, that I teach at Napa College. We are a state accredited institution. We have specific guidelines we have to meet. And none of the certification programs in the wine industry teach the only skill you need to be successful in the wine industry, which is how to sell it. And when I made that comment, the director of WSET at the time said, "Oh, you can't teach that to people." And I said, "Wait a minute, who in the audience here is or from Constellation?" And some people raised their hands. I said, "You have a 6-week training course that teaches you how to sell, right?" "Yes." "It's effective, right?" "Yes." It's not only that they don't teach it, they don't even understand that it can be taught. And they're offering certification. So to me, this is a huge lack in the whole world of wine education. I always think back, I was called in years ago to consult with the region of Priorat in northeastern Spain, in Catalonia. And I visited a few wineries, and then in the evening, one evening, they had a meeting with a few restaurants, a few hotels, and some wineries. And they wanted to talk about wine tourism and how they could make wine tourism better. And I started explaining that, you know, maybe they should treat different visitors in different ways. Not everybody wanted to go on a tour. Some people just wanted to taste. And I started talking about this, and the wineries all said, "Oh, no, 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 no. Everybody loves our tours." And I just sat there quietly because I knew what was going to happen, because the hotel owners said, "You know what they say when they come back after spending a day visiting wineries?" The first winery was great. They explained everything about the region, how they grow grapes, how they make wine, delicious wines, lovely visit. Second winery, we had to sit through the same thing all over again. Third winery, it was like torture. We had to sit through the same. We had the same presentation. They showed us the same grapes. They showed us the same barrels. They showed us the same tanks. God, it was awful. The winery was completely unaware of this. Oh no, they love our tours. Somebody's not asking enough questions. And the people they need to be asking questions of are consumers. And winemakers and people in the wine industry always assume, first of all, that they know best because they made it. And second of all, they assume they know consumers because they were a consumer once. The problem is 0.11% of wine consumers end up working in the wine business. The other 99.9% do not. And by definition, they are different from you. So my number one rule of marketing, whenever I talk to somebody in the wine business, you're not the market. Don't tell me what you like. Don't tell me what works for you. Don't tell me how it happened for you, because you're not the market. The market is the people who didn't join the wine industry.
Yes, agree, 100%, 100%. And then I think that's where we go wrong. We think everyone is like us, but I think the assumptions you just said it to this, just to finishing that that direction, that path you just started. The assumption is pretty much because you never ask yourself what we do and why you do, what is wrong, what we can improve. On the second, if we do, we never make the actually, and then sometimes we asking that, but you already have all the answers, so we don't really try to research to figure out if that. Well, actually, we don't really thinking about it. Most of people don't even make the questions. Who does a question? They already have the answers, so they don't really stop it to do research or think, or have a talk with the people who actually the consumers, have spent some time with consumers to understand what this 5 question is about it. So they just presume they know about it. So that's the assumption they have. And then and that's stopping them to make the questions, the hard questions. So sometimes they don't even make the questions. So it's something kind of environment or culture, or we build in the wine industry. That's something you need to disrupt it in some stage very soon, because we can't really keep the industry like it is. But I just want to finish it.
So I have one more thing to add to that. I know you're short for time. I have one more thing to add. Wineries always tell me that people love their tours, they love their visits, and they're very, very successful. As a teacher, I know which of my students has learned the topic and which has not, because I ask them questions. Admittedly, it's an exam, but I learn. And one of the first year I taught at Napa College, I gave an exam, and students did pretty darn well on the exam, but one question they almost all got wrong. And the man who hired me, Steve, said, "So what does that tell you?" And he was expecting me to say the students, and I said, "I did a really bad job of teaching that question." And he said, "Oh, you're going to be fine." Now, when people leave a winery, are they asked, "What do you remember from this visit?" They're not. So how do we know what we're teaching? How do we know what they're remembering? Because I've done those surveys, they remember nothing. They won't remember when they get to the next winery. They won't remember the name of the winery they just visited. And if you've worked in a tasting room, you know this. They will come in and you say, "Where have you been today?" And they will say, "Oh, that winery down the road with the big tree in front." They spent an hour and a half at the winery, and they can't remember the name of the winery. And we're saying, "Oh no, we do an excellent job in our tasting room." As far as I'm concerned, as a teacher, that's an unmitigated disaster. That's saying I am teaching algebra, and when the student goes to the next class, they say, "What class did you take in the last hour?" And they say, "I don't know. Teacher was very interesting." But you don't know the name of the subject you're studying?
Oh, it's a very good example, because I work in the tasting room for 10 years. So exactly the answers I get with consumers was like pretty much the same. And I work in in Argentina, in Australia, the same. It's like a global issue. It's not just in US, it's not just Australia. Because I worked 10 years in different places, and then the same. Like when you ask, like, "Oh, which wineries did you get to?" This, like, "Oh yeah, that one just next door to the restaurant." Blah blah blah. They know the location better than the name of the winery. It's very incredible how to making the remarkable experience. It's a very good point. It's an absolutely very good point. My question for you, Paul, before I wanted to finish this podcast, I wanted to ask you 3. I always the same question for everyone. Gil, I'd like you to finish the podcast with the 3 advices for the people who are watching this podcast. and looking for doing marketing, sales, PR, all those kind of things we're discussing today, better on the tasting rooms. Actually, I think is a good way, or any other kind of the other business they have, they struggling for selling their wines. What then the three advices you could give it to us to improve ourselves, our business, or anything it could help the community to grow?
Okay, so number one is know or find out what it is that actually makes you different. How are you different from the competition? And why should people care about that? That's number one. If you don't know that, you've got nothing. I always say running a winery is like trying to enter the Olympics. If you don't know how you're different, you're going to be in the Olympics. Which sport? Haven't decided yet. That's not the way it works. First, you have to decide what sport. First, you have to decide what you're going to do better than anybody else. And then you can enter the Olympics. So first, understand what makes you different. Second of all, constantly compare yourself to your competitors in the market to make sure that you're doing everything you can to be better, to be more effective, to build better relationships. Compare, compare, compare. And then the last thing is listen. The great salespeople of the world are never the fastest talkers. They are the people who listen. I always say you cannot sell anything to anyone, but if you listen long enough, you'll find out what they want to buy, and then you can make that possible. So listen, listen, listen. And if you ask your visitors how they enjoy the experience, they will tell you it's wonderful. And then they will get in the car and they will say to each other, oh, brother, because they won't tell you the truth. You have to find out the truth. You have to find ways to listen to them where they're not just trying to make you feel good. So understand who you are, compare yourself, and constantly fight to make yourself better. And the last part is the only people whose opinion matters is not you or your wife it's your customers. And they're the ones who can tell you if you're going to be successful.
Yes, that's very good. This was one of that everyone needs to listen to this podcast. Oh my God. It was a very good lesson here, Paul. I'm very glad you took it at an hour with us to be able to share your knowledge. I love it that you and the other people in the podcast are just spending that an hour with us, just sharing knowledge, just to expanding the knowledge around the wine community, the wine industry, the way we can improve the things, the way we can move it forward. I think your contribution for that is very grateful for whole community. How we appreciate your stories and you appreciate your way, the different perspective, and then the things we're putting on the table to make us realize we can actually do better and we can actually moving forward in the wine industry. The wine industry, it's have lots of opportunities there. We just needed to do a few changes the way we communicate, I guess, and marketing and talking and sell. And I think that's something. It's the most thing that is very important for me in this podcast. Was the sell. I think it's selling things. Some people come in naturally, but some things it can be taught. Like you can be told about sell wines, and it's something lots of people say that is not possible, but everything is possible. So, and I think we can make the wine community selling wines.
Even if it comes naturally. With training, you can get better. And that's something we can never forget. Yeah.
Yes. And so for the people who doesn't believe it, people can sell, the sell can be, be told in the, by someone else. So it's wrong. We can teach people how to sell themselves wines, stories. They can tell many things. They don't need, to sell the service, sell anything they need to sell. We're selling ads all the time. So I think it's something.
And again, the critical element there is we can sell only what the customer wants to buy. So if we don't listen to the customer and understand they don't want to buy a Sauvignon Blanc with 0.74 titratable acidity, they want to buy a Sauvignon Blanc that makes them feel good when they pick the bottle up because they have something to talk about with their friends.
Yes.
That's what they want to buy.
Yes. Yeah. Listen to customers. Listen to the customers. That's something we needed to learn yesterday. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure. Keep doing what you're doing, Priscilla.
Thank you so much.